Hello and welcome to, well, it's another reading project, isn't it, Varsha?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We have more
What?
reading projects than we have books that we read this year. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, that might be true. I thought you were going to have more reading projects than I have Facebook friends, and that's almost certainly true. Uh,
That's
being 2025. I can't remember if this was your idea or my idea. It might have been a combination of both.
hmm
It usually is somewhere along that way. But we're going to occasionally, I don't think we've any fixed schedule on making our way through some NYRB books. Um, and we don't really have a reading order as such, although I've sort of picked one from the start. But
hmm
you have a growing backlog, am I right?
Yes, I do. So I have the NYRB subscription that sends me one book every month from what they published that month, which is just one of several that they published. So there's no way we're keeping up with this unless we read almost exclusively NYRB books. So we'll get through them at whatever pace. So I have a backlog of the books that have been sent
Yeah.
each month through the subscription. And yeah, I think the first book is kind of an attempt to start in publication order, but that's just not
But,
gonna work, is it?
but it's not even because the Mediterranean cooking book is
That's true.
really the number one, the
Yeah.
memoirish kind of cooking book. So we kind of blew that out of the water.
hmm
But it for me, it sort of looks at books that I don't think we'd ever do planned reads for otherwise types of
mm,
books.
that's
We
true.
don't tend to do an awful lot of translated fiction. We don't tend to do any non-fiction,
Mm,
and even the English language books that kind of sit a little outside of even our literary side hustly kind of books that we're doing as well.
that's
So
true. Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to, like, I got the NYRB subscription, for
mm,
instance, because a very large part of their catalog is translated fiction, and a lot of it is fiction that's either been translated for the first time or it's bringing back things into publication that have been out of print for a while. So it's just a way to sort of read literature that we wouldn't
yeah.
otherwise, right? Yeah,
And as we know, there's no point reading a book if you can't discuss it at the end. So
that's true. Yeah.
yeah.
What are we even reading for? If
So
we read and we don't talk about it, have we read it at all?
haven't read it. Well, indeed. Um, so it's starting with me and you, but who knows what waifs and strays will pick up along the ways. I think we're
That's
going
true.
to alternate for the moment, being on my channel, being on your channel, which is Reading by the Reading Mountain, which has like a, a lot of our discussions on it.
Yes. So at this point, until the foreseeable future, I think discussions is almost exclusively what I do on my channel. So I'm glad that we have yet another project going that can maybe keep my channel alive
Yeah.
for a bit longer.
Yeah. I was thinking about doing a video about all my ongoing reading projects, but then I
Mm.
thought nobody wants to watch a 2 hour video. So
Gonna have to break that up.
my OCD kind of spectrum brain just likes the idea of working through a list of stuff
Yeah, yeah,
and going,
same. Same.
away you go. So we are discussing Family Lexicon by Natalia Ginzburg. Isn't it?
I brought a book this time to show.
Oh yay!
Yeah.
And like I have to admit, it's been months ago that I read this. Trying to get this scheduled in between all of our other reading projects has been somewhat tricky, but I did tab my way along and I did make my way through my tabs beforehand to
Hmm.
kind of go through. I would say that it's going to be a sporty discussion, but in general, there's literally nothing to spoil
Yeah.
unless you consider the fact that World War II happened. A spoiler.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like it's a memoir of a family, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I don't think I knew this going into the book, but it's a memoir. Like I thought it was fiction because I think it was
Hmm.
even like listed in the fiction section of
It
Family
is. That's
Lexicon.
right.
But it's actually the author's memoirs of her own family growing up. She's the youngest child of that family, and she's not quite as present in the book as the
Yeah,
rest of the members are.
that's true.
But um, yeah, but for all that, and when I knew, I think right in the introduction, she tells you that this is about her own family. I was expecting to maybe not enjoy it as much as I did,
Hmm.
but it did read very much like, say, a historical fiction that documents the history of a country through the family. There are many of those, right? That's a
Yeah,
standard sort
that's
of
right. Yeah,
trope that you get with historical fiction. And this read like that, and it was great. I enjoyed it
yeah,
far more than that introduction made me think I might.
yeah. It's I, I I think it's very very funny in parts. As
Yeah.
often like we get a window into a family dynamic lore or lexicon, if you want, in terms of
Yeah.
that. But I do think the forward from beforehand, because sometimes I skip forwards. This one
Mhm.
tends to be a page, and there's an afterward either as well,
Mhm.
that gives it context. And I think the start or the preface basically says she could have changed the names. She could have
Mm.
upscaled some of it, but she every time she went to do it, it sort of didn't feel true or didn't ring right because
Yeah.
these are things that happened, and that gives it a good context for what's going to happen because it doesn't glorify or glorify is the wrong word. It doesn't kind of blow up the major events that happens in their life as like these
Mm.
major incidents. They are just things that happen to that family along the way, and some of them are.
Right.
There's a lot of deaths. There's a lot of arrests. There's a lot of things happen to it, but it's
Mm.
not like end of the chapter and then he was arrested. Flip to the next chapter and then we get some sort of dramatic extrapolation of that. It's just stuff that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminded me a little bit of well, it reminded me of so many books that we've read or shows actually. There was Parable of the Sower, I think,
Hmm.
comes to mind, where she just gives these clinical statements about really bad things that happen. And she does go on to talk about it after a while, but she mentions it first and then talks about it at length, like towards the end when she discusses the death of her husband, right?
Hmm.
And and I guess it reminds me of a little bit of 100 Years of Solitude, which I'm reading at the moment. Again, like the history of a country through the
Hmm.
eyes of a family, except 100 Years of Solitude does it so differently. But there's a little bit about the structure of that, where each chapter sort of documents the history of one person. This book, of course, doesn't have chapters, but it does this thing where it's not telling you the history, sorry, serially of a family.
Yeah.
It's like it'll mention events that happen, I don't know, 10 years later, and then it'll come back to it when it's time to talk about it. So structurally it reminded me of that, and also a little bit about the fact that we're documenting one family and their
Hmm.
interactions with the neighborhood. And finally it reminded me of Dairy Girls, which is
Right.
interesting because it's again like bad things are happening, but family life carries on, and it's not so different from what you think. Like it's not, at least the way it's been presented here, doesn't dominate the things, the bad things happening around don't dominate
Mm.
your daily life, which I think was very interesting, both in this this and that show, which is one of my favorite shows ever. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because uh, it is like the Dairy Girls comparison is interesting because Dairy Girls works because we get a window into ordinary people's lives and the humor and all that lies
Mm,
within that. And we sort of like get a like pull up a chair in the corner of the room and just kind of sit there and watch it and kind of laugh
yeah.
along with them and be horrified in other ways and judge people.
Mm,
Like I think there's an awful lot of Dairy Girls. We judge the characters and the people that are within there as much as they're judging
yeah.
each other. Yeah, I think that's an interesting comparison. I like that one quite a bit. The other thing that kind of sets it apart is actually what made her write this because it
Mm,
was in the 60s. She was living in Kensington in London,
mm, mm,
and she was a long way from home. And she'd
mm,
been remarried by that stage, and she was miserable in London, and she hated the people around her in London. She was
mm.
really longing for this sense of back home. So going in and writing a memoir about her time
Yeah.
in Italy, the breakup of her family, basically, in a lot of ways, and then the different changes of dynamics and that kind of stuff. And I can imagine writing about certain one of those family members because she does talk about the fact that they don't really speak that much anymore,
Mm,
family, and we get a sense of that through the book and as we pull
yeah.
through,
Yeah.
um, that it must have been very cathartic for her, to kind
Mm,
of do
mm.
that and delve into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And and it's interesting also that either because of the way she wrote it or because she was the youngest member of the family, so a lot of the family traditions and the lexicon, so to speak, had been
Hmm.
established, I think, by the time she was born. Maybe it was a combination of the two. It felt almost like she was an observer of this family, not quite a member. But I think a large part of it might be because she didn't talk about herself too much
Yeah.
through the course of the book, but also just Like I kept having this image of like a little baby observing all the like adult silliness around her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are a lot of very big figures within the book,
Mm,
and you know, I think it's very much an example of a patriarchy, like
yeah.
in the best and the worst terms, in a lot of ways. And obviously, her father dominates a lot of the book, and how his domineering presence kind of upsets and
Mm,
ends up sort of ripping the family apart in some ways just by being who he is. He
yeah.
seemed like he was a lot to read sometimes in the book, and I can only imagine when you were living with him, it was like, oh my god, I'm tired of this. You know, it was kind of like, yeah, but
Yeah.
he's never demonized either. You know, so it's kind of interesting in that way, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you have these members of the family that you kind of know say weird things, but they okay, sometimes they like the father says a lot of like bigoted things, for instance, and you know that they're still kind people when it
Yeah,
matters, or they have other dimensions to them besides the said bigotry, which I think is kind of an important lesson in general, right? It's easy to put people in boxes because of like the one thing they said, and
that's it.
with the cancel culture being one of the major ways we interact online. um, I think this kind of nuance that the story brings to members of the family who you might judge as horrible people, but she
Yeah,
clearly loves and respects respects them, and rightly so, because like he did provide for his family, and he and there were things that you might agree with him about, like his anti-fascist philosophies, for instance. So yeah, it just I think it really brought out the fact that there are many, many, many dimensions to people, and you shouldn't judge them or dismiss them based on one thing.
yeah. Definitely. And I think part of that is because we're literally seeing the inside of the house. You know,
Mm,
the things that would normally be kept within those four closed walls of people. And
right, yeah.
we see what he says, but he's also pretty damning of everybody else within the family as well. Like he doesn't reserve it for outside people. He doesn't reserve it for just Mussolini. Yeah, I mean, his son is an idiot as well,
Yeah.
and everybody has their little things that annoy him, or that they talk about each other, or even that their own interpersonal relationships, brother and sister, some of them, because there's difference in age. And we get that sense from
Mm,
Natalia, because she's so young, that she is just observing and sort of in awe of how other
yeah.
people are living their lives. And actually, as they all get older, how things like politics and all that kind of stuff really starts to shape the family and their relationships and all of that kind of stuff that goes through, which I think it's one of the things that makes it really enjoyable, because while it's really funny and while there's sort of interesting stories, you sort of know, like, along the same while, because of the time that it's going through, that these other events are happening at the same time. So it's
Mm,
like we are going through and moving through time. And I know certainly, and I can see, go, we're getting to 36, 37. That, we're getting to this stage within European history,
yeah.
that these events are really starting to happen. And certainly they do sort of mesh and overtake each other at some point. And obviously, this family that started off in a house in Turin, with a
Mm,
lot of them, 5 kids, isn't it? The mother and the father, this maids, whatever else is going on. And then they start to branch out through a lot of Europe as well, France, Switzerland,
mm,
you know, Belgium, etc. They all kind of start to branch out, and it sort of gives it another sense of, like, it's not just about this family, but it is about this family. It's like
yeah.
literally their lore, and they're going to spread out themselves and influence the places that they go to.
Yeah, yeah. I like that sense of spreading out and influencing. Like I didn't think of it like that, but that's a great point that they started here and they grew out. And and while this is very much a portrait of a single family, this could be what happened to a lot of people
Yes.
during the war. Uh, yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think, again, I said this was a book that you couldn't spoil. Like, without knowing what happened to her, we know what her surname is. So when
Mm, yeah,
certain characters come into the story, we
right.
know what's going to happen with them. If you know what I
Yeah,
mean, there's sort of like a very open secret going along there.
yeah,
But it's not in a rush. It's not presented that way. We just kind of know that because of the author's name and the fact that it's
yeah,
true
yeah.
life and all of that kind of stuff. Which I thought again was very interesting because at a certain point it was like, oh, get on with it,
Yeah. Just
what's
tell
going
me
to
you got
happen here?
married to this
Yeah,
guy.
exactly.
Yeah, that was also very interesting, right? Like I talked before about like sort of a clinical presentation of everything. Like she just brought this man on the page. She didn't, I feel like any other book you would read that has this sort of future looking back into the past perspective would mention briefly that this is the man I ended up marrying,
Yeah.
right? It did not. It just brought the man on the page, talked about everything he meant to like the events associated with him and the rest of the family, and then said, "Oh, then I married him, and then we moved here," and that. And she used the exact same tone when talking about
Mhm.
his eventual jailing and death, which somehow hit that much more powerfully. But yeah, you're right. Like, certain events are coming, but you almost get the sense that that might not be important, or that's not quite what she wants to talk about
Yeah.
just yet. And so, yeah, we'll focus on this other thing for the moment. But please give me a tell me when this is coming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting because it is clinical the whole way through for her. You're absolutely right. Like she just presents these whimsical tales, these arguments, all of these things very much matter of fact, and people coming in and out of the house seem to be
Mm,
that kind of family. And without kind of centering too much on the father, we also kind of know that they're not a poor family. They're not a stupid family.
mm,
They're not. He's an established scientist. His kids go on to good things, good upbringings. Like that, they are not as often as the case. I think in this kind of stories from this kind of time. Oh God, we grew up penniless and all of
mm.
that kind of stuff. It wasn't that story either. It's literally just what happened within their family and to the
Yeah.
brothers and sisters and how they grew up together and all of those things.
Yeah, yeah. And for all that, it seems like a fairly unremarkable family. Like it could
Absolutely.
be just another family, which is great. Like there were members in it that reminded me of members from my family. For all that, I don't think we mentioned it yet. This is translated from Italian, right?
That's right.
So
That's right. Yeah.
it documents the history of an Italian family. And for all that they are in a different country, speak a completely different language than I do, there are so many members of the family that I could sort of relate members of my family to my aunts and uncles who remind me of the people on the page. But I think specifically in regard to the phrases from the lexicon that she
Mhm.
attributed to them, right? Like the father's tendency to rubbish most things using a series of phrases. I have an uncle who does that.
Yeah.
The mother's tendency to like, be young and like trying to find her inner child even when she was like super not super old. I don't think we get to see her age that much, but
Mhm.
even as a grandparent, her like need for movement and constant activity. I have an aunt who reminds me of that. So, and I
Yeah.
guess just like the general family dynamic a little bit. I'm an only child, but it like with my larger family, I find that dynamic occasionally when all the cousins meet up, right? So yeah, it could be any family anywhere. That's the sense I get. So you would think, which is why it's surprising how much I enjoyed and liked the book, because it felt like it would be a very boring thing to
Yes.
read, if nothing else, but it wasn't.
Yeah, it has. I mean, it tastes an awful lot to how it's written. I think it's very readable, and because it's kind of one event after the other one, and this happened, and this person came into their lives, and in some cases, we can use our known context. Like there's people like Carlo Levi that came into the story that I know a bit about, who was
Mm,
exiled, and I've watched a film about him and stuff. So when these people come in to their lives, it's not mentioned within the book about who they are or anything, but because of that, there's an extra kind of bit put on top of it. And even that's why, like these books with the notes at the back, when you
yeah.
flick back and go, oh my God, I didn't realize that was a thing. Like when there was a whole point, one of the ones that really hit me was the fact that they tried to exile a lot of the Jewish community to Madagascar
Mm,
and stuff within
mm,
it, and that's within the notes in the back. And I often think when you're reading kind of these classics and they give you that historical context, because like I certainly grew up in what will only be given to me in history lessons from my schooling within
mm.
Britain or otherwise. Yes, some quick technical difficulties. On my end, not in Vars's. Vars's
No.
just perfect. There you go. So yeah, we're back.
And
Uh,
now you have jinxed it, Chris. We're gonna
I
have
have
technical
jinxed it. I know.
difficulties.
Change camera and all that kind of stuff. So yes, we were talking about how readable an awful lot of this was, and how it made it flow. I also don't think it's the kind of book you could binge like in a day or day or two, because
Mm,
I do think if you are just reading about somebody's life, it'd be a bit like sitting in the room. You know, if one person's telling a story in a family gathering and
mm.
it goes on too long, you're like, oh God, yeah, yeah. We've all been there as well.
Yeah, yeah, that that has happened. Yes.
Mm,
Yes, it does feel like getting to know someone over the course of the book, right? So you do want to do that in snippets. I definitely agree with that. I think the most I read at a time was about 10 to 15 pages until
okay.
we got to the end, which,
Yeah.
because of the war, it moved more quickly and more things happened. I feel like she, there were no chapters again, but the sections got shorter and we switched to talking about different people. So it didn't feel like, we were reading the same thing to get bogged down by. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I also never got a sense that I really knew anybody super well within the
Mm,
family,
that's true.
because even the father is almost like a caricature in some ways. Like he has some depths. We get some sense when it gets later on, when he does his political rally and all of that kind of stuff, of kind
Mm,
of the fact that he has some sort of, pride about that fact that he didn't think he was that person, and yet he was able to command that thing. But one of my favorite bits at the start that caused me actually highlighted an awful lot was around the grandmother. I don't know if these
yes.
resonated with you. So um um she married her husband because of his pronunciation and because she wanted a black velvet coat for the winter. It
Yeah.
was not a happy marriage. And then it goes on to say when the mother and father are getting together, the grandmother was opposed to the marriage, but then she agreed to try to get to know my mother, which I thought was great. Um, and then her Uncle Cesare's wife, because my grandmother's opinion, an actress was even worse than a woman who made the sign of the cross. So the mother seems, or the grandmother seems like a really interesting character and
Yeah.
influence within this family as well. Like there was multiple instances where this very young girl Natalia was able to
Mm.
recall either things that she's seen or presumably things that she heard told about her grandmother.
Yeah, yeah. The and you kind of also get the sense of like where the father got his
Absolutely.
what extremely dismissive ideas of pretty much everything from
Yes.
all his strong opinions. And yeah, yeah, I love that matriarchal figure in the family, and they all have to visit her because she hates traveling to this
Yes.
other place.
Everybody else has to make accommodations.
Yeah,
And again, we all know people like that as well within the
yeah,
family. It's just one of those things.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, this internal lore, especially like I love this section when they're growing up as kids. And
Hmm.
even though there's probably a decent age range between them, these kind of phrases or these games that they used to play, or the poems that they used to write, the songs that they used to sing, some of
Yeah,
them quite humorous or otherwise. But again, it gives you a sense of that they were basically just normal kids.
yeah,
There
yeah,
was kind of like the ones that were closer together and otherwise, or what they were. But at that stage, they were just a normal family. They didn't have
yeah.
any kind of split or otherwise.
Mm. And the kids go through some of the elder kids go through a pretentious phase in their like
Mhm.
love of what is it, Proust, was it?
Yes.
And talking about him constantly. And yeah, it felt like any other family. I did want to circle back to something you said about
Yeah.
like how you don't get to know people too well through the course of the book, which I think again is very interesting, and like I'm sure it was intentional by the
Mhm.
author. The so one of the things that I wonder about when people write books about their own lives is like how many people they've offended in the process, right? But
Sure.
in this book, there are some things that she sort of seems to be revealing about what the family thinks about some of their neighbors and friends, which maybe is not news to them. Maybe they don't find, maybe this is not how they found found out the family's opinion of them, because I think she writes things about her sisters-in-law, right? The people her
Yeah.
brothers were married to and so on. So maybe it was a well-known thing among the family. But yeah, I was thinking about this author Thomas Wolfe, who I haven't
Yeah.
read much by, or maybe I haven't read anything by, but he wrote a book about his hometown that apparently offended everyone, and then he wrote another one called "You Can't Go Home Again," again about how everyone got offended and now he can't go back home. So I was I was surprised when she's like, "I'm going to use real names," because I think that guy didn't. He used fake names, but everyone knew who he meant.
Yeah.
So this was interesting to me, but maybe she didn't intend to offend, because again, like I the thing we already mentioned, because of the distance with which
Hmm.
she's written this book, like she wasn't even a part of this. She's just looking at it from the outside and just documenting it. No judgment, no dissection of any exchanges.
Yeah, and I think the point that you make there about if she had changed the names, I think it would have had no difference because people would have
Yeah,
known exactly as you talked about. Like, I
that's
mean,
true.
and communities aren't that big or otherwise. People would have been able to delve in and get to
Mm,
know exactly what it was about. But she also kind of talks about in the preface and so far as every time she thought about doing it, sort of robbed something
mm,
from the storytelling in some ways, as if it was true up to a point and then it was fiction.
yeah.
But I think while it is fiction to a certain degree, she wanted it to be a representation because again, her purpose was to reconnect with her
Mm,
childhood and her happy memories and the people that she loved. So even though she might have painted people in sort of a slightly negative brush, I think the very inference is that I miss these people all the same, and I
yeah,
miss these
yeah,
people around me in a fond way, in a way that I don't have in my life now. And
yeah,
it sort of makes it bittersweet in some ways because life is an awful lot about just not happy memories, but also things that annoy you. And it's that classic thing of sometimes the thing that has annoyed you all your life is the thing that you come to miss when it's not there,
right.
that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. Yeah, sort of like wading through all the annoyances to find out that there is actually something deep there,
Yeah.
which, yeah, I can definitely appreciate that.
Yeah. I don't know if you have you those sort of feelings about because you're relocated as well.
Hmm.
If like, maybe you're not at the same age stage as Ms. Ginsburg when she wrote this, but there must be certain things that you kind of think both whimsically and not so whimsically about and at times, but the kind of it's like just resonates of home.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a lot of things that growing up I tended to look upon somewhat disdainfully, or at
Hmm.
like, oh, like people are so you know overbearing or so
Yeah.
interested in your lives, and they gossip about you, like the kind of negative things that you notice without noticing or observing the fact that it comes from a place of affection most
Yes.
of the
Yes.
times. Yeah, I do tend to miss that because I have a lot less family here, and I think the culture is different, the society is different. Like back home, you see a kid running around, you can go pick it up and play with it, and like the parents won't mind. But like, here I have to ask permission before petting a dog, for instance. So,
I was wondering where that story was going, Varsha. Thanks. Thank God it ended in you petting a dog.
so like, there's just some things that like people do that are just that I like, and it
Yeah.
when I'm back home, it feels like people intruding on my space, but then I miss it
Yeah.
when I'm back here. So yeah.
Yeah, it's there's a sort of normalcy to it as
Mm,
well in terms of like different places, different locations have different ways of being. And I'd say, you know, 1960s London's very different from 1930s Turin,
yeah, yeah.
or 1930s Rome as she ends up in later on. Um, so like, how do you talk about events of this book? I'll talk about basically the kids. I think
Mm,
I'm not even sure I could name all of them. To be honest, I've got
yeah.
Gilberto, I've got Paolo, I've got Mario. I'm struggling at that point.
You
She's
remember
the
a
fourth
lot
one,
more than I.
Natalia. I went through my tabs before I started off in this,
Okay.
and it was only ones people that had tabbed. So there
Mm,
was one of the things that really struck me is that obviously the whole thing starts with them gathered around the table and having dinner together, and that
yeah.
very normal. I think if I was to think what Italian culture is very centered around, it is that kind of family atmosphere about gathered around the table and an awful lot of noise and all of that kind of stuff. It's been
Mm,
represented many times, even in films and otherwise. Um, but that was like the hub or the place where the most action happened at the start. But
mm,
as the kids get older and
mm,
they start to act out their influences of their parents. Even though I didn't see reading it at the time, and this is one of the nice things about tabbing and going back and see, there were definitely stages where you could see it kind of change, the relationship change between the family and
Mm,
especially the parents. So there was a instance where the father would say that you shouldn't intrude on people's good grace, you shouldn't overstay your welcome, you shouldn't,
yeah.
do all those things. So they would turn down food from family friends, they would turn down lifts, but it just meant that they starved and
Mm,
traveled back late in quite dangerous conditions
mhm,
because that was the influence that the father had
yeah.
on that was just exactly what they had to do. And why, as that progressed through the book, not too far actually, some of the kids really started to resent the father as being overbearing and reaching.
Mm,
They wouldn't speak, and as soon as he left the room, it would change the whole dynamic because it wasn't like they grouped the father and mother together in that regard. It was very much about the father,
mm,
and I thought that kind of insight speaks to an awful lot of teenage kind of growing up and where you become aware, more socially aware, and that kind of stuff. To the point that some of them obviously moved away, some of them,
yeah.
wanted away from the day to day part of that, but without necessarily removing themselves from the family altogether. They didn't become totally estranged in any way, which I thought
Mm,
was sort of interesting.
yeah. Yeah. That was interesting. Um, and again, like speaking of how this book reminds me of like elements of my own family or my
Mhm.
own culture, it I can't say this was true of my family in particular, but that is a very common dynamic, right? Like the father laying down the law, and when
Yeah.
he leaves the room, now we can have fun, and that includes the mother. The mother sort of like the indulgent person who gives you things that the father denies you
Yes.
sometimes,
Yes.
which um yeah, I don't know how much that is true in the American family dynamic, but it's definitely true in the Indian family
Mhm.
dynamic to a great extent. Again, not specifically mine, but I think I've seen that in other families that I've interacted with.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I read this recently, and I think a lot of the conversations that I've been having with friends at the moment have been about how we view our parents and that kind of stuff, and
Mm,
actually the people that we thought they were, what that kind of stuff. I don't think you ever really get to know who your parents really are, or even the inner dynamics of that relationship because you don't examine it the same way because it's just what you grew up with. Do you know
yeah.
what I mean? That it was the normal thing at that stage. And I think it's only when you get slightly later in life that you kind of have your own relationships and you see how extended families relationships works and all that kind of stuff that you kind of go, oh, I didn't notice that
Mm,
beforehand, or I didn't know that was actually what that person did within that functional relationship or otherwise. And Ginsburg talks about this with her own mother, is that like an awful lot of her love for her mother was wrapped up from a very young girl in the fact that her mum was a protector, not her father,
mm,
but her mum was a protector. And actually throughout life, and she doesn't know at what point that changes, but when she's writing the book, she thinks back and goes, I don't need my mum's protection anymore, but
yeah.
the love still remains.
Mm,
So, and in actual fact, it probably goes back the other way that she has to
yeah.
protect her mother in some ways, and she's postulates kind of like when did that change or how did that change? And
Yeah.
obviously the love wasn't wrapped up in the protection part all along because there was something more there. And I really liked some of those elements of the book because as we sort of jump backwards and forwards in time and her mum's relationship changes and she still listens to her mum,
Yeah.
there is kind of this sense that she doesn't just do what her mum says carte blanche anymore. At a certain point, she gets
Mm,
she's a wife or whatever, she kind of decides differently.
yeah. 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 And that's a great point that you bring up because uh maybe not in terms of like the protector of the family, but there were things that I went through with my parents that like when did this change? They used to do this for me, now I do this for them.
Yes, exactly.
I feel like everyone goes through that with their parents at some point, like this realization that you're growing up, but also comes with it the realization that your parents are getting older and
Okay.
you should probably spend more time with all the stuff that goes with it, the melancholy associated with it, but also I guess a certain amount of I don't know, self-esteem and like the knowledge that you're
Yeah.
grown up now. So yeah, that was a very astute observation that she had. Like, thanks for bringing that up. I'd forgotten about it, but but it was
Yeah.
something that I highlighted. Yeah,
As we're going through. Yeah. So
yeah,
and even to that fact, the father kind of talks about the fact that the kids as they grow up aren't their interrelationships aren't the same with each other either. That
yeah.
people who were like tied together all the time, now barely talk. And I think that
Mm,
again, there's a truth in that. That
yeah.
kind of goes back and out in my relationships and my siblings sort of goes in an up and down phases as people get busy and you don't have as much time, but then at other
Mm,
times we need each other and all that kind of stuff. So I think it is a book that when you read, even though it's 1930s Turin, a lot of those things still stay true.
yeah.
You know, there's
Yeah.
still you can
Definitely.
kind of examine your own journey and your own relationships with your own family and see the characters there for yourself.
Yes. Very, very much so. I definitely, like I said, found it very relatable, not even being from the part of the country that
Mhm.
she is, like part of the world that she's from, or just not speaking the same language. And what, nearly a century into the future. So,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
What what did you think of the lexicon part of it all? I think that I love that as a premise, exploring this family through its most repeated phrases.
yeah.
And I love that each person had sort of a different use for their most commonly phrases. With the father, we've already discussed, used it largely to talk about how much he hated most things, like to express his opinion of
Yeah.
them. And it's like, I have an uncle who goes, "Yeah, that's waste. That's waste." And the father reminded me of that quite a bit. But like we talked about, there's a lot more depth to them. It's just like this is something that we joke about in my family. Like, if he were here, he'd say this is waste. So, and the mother, her phrases were all from stories that she heard growing up, or even like as a grown up, stories that she hears and repeats, and then like phrases from those stories that they then use as a family to refer to various events, like that
Mhm.
have the same characteristics of what the story represents. This also I is great because this is something that I didn't used to do when I was a kid, but like my husband does a lot now, and there's so many things from movies that he repeats, or like from stories that from like things that happen to him and his brothers. There's strange things that people say that he tends to repeat a lot, and now like it's something that I do
Mhm.
whenever similar situations happen. So again, like the relatability of it all, it wouldn't even have occurred to me as a concept to think about my interactions with my loved ones in terms of like the most common phrases that we use with
Yeah,
them. But when she puts it like this, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. That
absolutely.
is like one of the things that we share. And I think that's something that she says, right? Like if we were all stuck in a dark cave, she and her siblings, and all
Mhm.
they'd have to do is say some of these most repeated phrases, and they'd find each other somehow, which is fantastic. I love
Yeah.
that as a premise for this book.
Yeah, because they reach very far back in their relationship, for nearly their earliest memories, or they don't even know where they started, but they are just these phrases
Right.
that come back, and it sort of makes me think of things that when I was growing up, again, things you would have discussed that you just accepted as being truths in life that
Yeah.
everybody did, and it's only when you discuss with other people and they're looking at you going, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I remember doing this with a group once where basically saying, I remember my dad bought a green car, right?
Mm.
And on like 2 weeks in or something, somebody went through a red light and wrote the car off and crashed into him. And he says, "Well, I mean, I should have known. I mean, I got it cheap because it was a green car. Green cars are notoriously unlucky, right?"
Okay.
So I thought, oh yeah, I didn't know that, but that if that's
Mm.
true, that's true. And I was telling somebody about this, they'd got a new car and it was green. I was going, God, you're brave. You are brave having a green car because, like, you don't see that too often because they're so unlucky and they're like, what are you talking about? This is not a thing. And I was like, but you sort of accept that as like a
Yeah.
truth of
Yeah.
life or as like a standard that everybody knows. And I'm like, because you listen to your parents and you kind of think
Yeah.
everything that comes out of the mouth is gospel, you're kind of like, oh, I know that now. That's good. That's not a problem. And yeah, so it kind of reminded me of an awful lot of that. Even like the relationship when she's talking about her mother and Maria or Paula, whatever what it was, that they had a very close relationship and they wouldn't let Natalia in at that stage to
Mm.
them
Yeah.
because she says she didn't know how to lend her gears, which
Yeah.
is, that phrase, she didn't know that yet. And she was
Yeah.
in the outside looking in because she wasn't, she wasn't in the lexicon yet, or she wasn't
Yeah.
kind of doing that kind of bit, but it stuck with Natalia
Yeah.
and it
Yeah.
sort of gives you that idea of, right, okay, this is interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That was one of my favorite ones. And it was unclear to me, tell me if you figured this out, whether it was baby Natalia heard it wrongly as lend me her gears, or if the mother was using it wrongly, but she stuck with it throughout. She didn't correct
That's
herself
attack. Yeah.
at any point. So either way, it was fantastic. And it's one of those things, right? Like one of the things that we repeat a lot in my family is things that my cousins and my nephews used to say when they were babies.
Right.
And like my cousin, for instance, used to say that it's shining so wittily with the sugar on the top. She meant shining so brightly with sugar on top. So whenever
Okay.
something's shining with sugar, we always say that now. So yeah, so this felt like one of those things like that she overheard as a baby, and then it just sort of stuck
Yeah.
as lending her gears.
Yeah. I mean, there's loads. I'm sure every family has it. Hospital was hospital because my younger sister couldn't say hospital. She
Yeah.
was saying the P the wrong way round, umberdoodle instead of
Mm,
umbrella. There's lots of those, and I'm sure every family has very similar stories in a
yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
ways. But and it even extends to, I think, personality traits, because and again, one of my favorites in the whole book is this Alberto,
Mm,
who was called a rapscallion and a hooligan by the father his entire life. And even when he graduated high school and became a doctor,
yeah.
and the family are going, but he got an A. And the father's going, of course he got an A. I'm his father. They had to give him an A because he's my son. He was taking the credit for it. And even when people get sick, and there's something like we have a doctor in the family, and the father's like, Albert, you're going to go to Alberta. What the hell does he know? He's an idiot, and it didn't matter what he achieved in life or what he did. He
Yeah.
was still always, oh, he's useless,
Yeah.
whatever. And again, that's very true of an awful lot of families as well, I
That's
think.
true. Yeah. 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 Some of the adults tend to forget that the kids grow up and maybe maybe become competent. Your
Yeah.
opinion is of how they were when they were 7 years old. Okay. You just and I like how Alberto's just kind of like learn to live with it. It doesn't seem like they have a contentious relationship over it.
No.
He's like, yeah, no, that's what he thinks, and like is completely dismissive of his father's opinion of him, or at least like it wasn't something that she ever mentioned. So I'm guessing that they didn't, have big battles over it. It might have been one of the things that alienated him from the father, but it's not something like, him trying to him developing daddy issues like this might go in say a family drama or whatever, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
it's something. I'm okay. We have a good relationship otherwise, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But it is interesting that actually these parental child relationships sort of overflew a bit. Like, when isn't it Mario that got arrested for
Mm,
being the editor of the paper, and then he had to flee
yeah.
to Switzerland. But actually, even though he left, it was assumed that it came from the father, even though it didn't.
Yeah.
In some ways, and the father was being watched then
Mm,
because of the familial relationship, kind of the other way around.
mm,
And it was Mario used to wind him up with being in jest a Mussolini supporter, just to
mm,
wind him up and get a
yeah.
rise out of him, and just
Yeah.
kind of do that. So you can see the children sort of rebelling against, and ultimately it led to a lot of them moving away then, and
Yeah.
kind of making their own forge in life, because it probably I sort of read it as a kind of respect in some ways, because those contentious kind of blow up arguments didn't happen
Mm,
that we've seen. And it's probably a case that my dad is who my dad is, my father is who my father is,
yeah.
and they respect him enough, but also know that if they are in close proximity, it's going to blow up at some stage, and they can't make their own life without kind of spreading their own
Mm,
wings themselves. That's St.
yeah.
Francis
Yeah.
or whatever.
That absolutely makes sense. Yeah, you learn to live with what you can while also
Yeah,
avoiding the stuff that hurts you, right? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
That's a good point.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
There were some things from the war too that like when they went to jail, they talked about it
mhm,
almost like, people were having a picnic and they were like again, like I think and I'm sure it wasn't as easy and simple as she wrote about it at the time. Like people being
mhm,
arrested. Her mom was apparently almost like sad when they got released from jail. Um, because she didn't have reason to go anymore. Like her life was less interesting now.
yeah,
But that just I mean, I feel like that's probably not quite how it went down, right? It was probably just a way of relieving tension or something that they joked about. But
mhm,
so she writes about it almost like it happened in reality, but it almost feels like a way to tell us about awful things
yeah,
without, making it awful to read. which again like makes the whole thing work in the opposite direction somehow. And yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Like even as everybody's relationship changes and the father goes away and he stuck in Belgium, isn't he?
Mm,
At some stage
yeah.
he can't get there. And
Mm,
again, the whole family dynamic's very different. The mother's sort of free, but also at a loss because
yeah.
she's now getting front line and center at some stage and
Mm,
you know it changes the family dynamic wholly because there's literally only Natalia at that stage,
yeah.
sort of within proximity to her, and
Yeah.
everybody else is sort of away. So, um, yeah, it just it was never not interesting in some way because there was always some change in dynamic, and I'm sure like just about every family is the same. There's always fast forward 4 or 5 years, there's something different happens within a family. Either somebody gets older, or somebody has a child, or whatever it is, they move house, and
Mm,
things are life has a way of just constantly evolving.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think um and the I almost felt bad for Natalia in the beginning when just like, oh, she had a great relationship with the elder sister, but never developed that kind with me. But again, it didn't feel like she was feeling bad about this at all. But just that kind of statement made me feel like, oh, did she not have a good relationship with her
yeah,
mother? But then we find out like later on when she talks about how she sort of started to protect her mother
yeah,
or how she really didn't need her anymore, but then she appreciated her being around to take care of her child, to help her take care of the children. I think they developed their own form of relationship, right? Like, so it sort of evened out if nothing else. And maybe she did,
indeed.
like again, she didn't put too much of herself in the book, so we don't hear about the stuff that that did go well. But yeah, I liked how it all culminated.
Yeah,
And you talked about a dinner scene like that it starts with, and I think it also ends with one. It ends practically the same way that it starts
yeah,
after all this sort of momentous shift and everything. It you almost get the feeling like nothing has changed, which it has, but also nothing has, because you can like go back to this and find familiarity in all of this, right? Which I think is what she wanted to do with the writing of this book. So I thought it was a great way to end it too,
yeah.
just the
Well,
way it started.
it also sort of speaks to the fact that the family unit will prevail, even though like the world has literally gone to
Mm,
hell
yeah.
in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, and they have been directly or indirectly sort of at the center of it
Mm,
because one brother was in France and kind of
yeah.
France was very different from Italy, was very different
Mm,
from a lot of those places kind of had their own version of what happened along the way.
mm,
Uh, yeah, but the fact that there still is the family unit at the end, I think is
yeah.
sort of poetic in some ways, and they still have their phrases. They didn't lose anything during that period. They still held together, even though buildings mightn't be there
Yeah.
anymore or anything else. The family unit is still there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. That stays through, and it might look slightly different, but it's there.
Yeah,
And they still have a lot that made them a family in the first place. Yeah.
yeah.
I like that.
I I I want to talk about the marriage and the arresting
Mm,
and ultimately the death of her husband Leonie. It's sort of fascinating how she presents this because
yes.
it must have been very difficult to talk about it. Maybe this is the only way that she could talk about it, but you do get a sense that they really didn't have that much of a relationship because they never got a clean run
Mm,
of spending time together. And it's not like while he was involved, he obviously was running a secret newspaper and stuff like that. It was anti-fascist or otherwise. It wasn't like he was some sort of major ringleader or anything
mm,
like that. They were really just pumping him as being this kind of, suppressing free speech and all of that kind of stuff that was sort of happening at the time. But there's a sadness in the relationship as much
yeah.
as in the death. I don't know how you read it.
I I kind of got the sense that she didn't write too much about it because it was painful, or at least she
Mhm.
was actively avoiding putting her feelings on the page, which I think she did throughout, quite a bit. And it was only feelings that others expressed vocally that she found amusing to put on the page. So that that never felt like it was a big part of the book. But I kind of got the impression that they sort of made the most of what they could have in during a really horrible time. And like it hit really hard when she said that um that was the last time I saw him, and she wasn't really expecting to. But yeah, I think there. I agree that there was a certain sadness in it. It almost felt like during a difficult time they found each other and they kind of like were trying to hold on to it. But I don't know if I'm projecting with all of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think she does. I think that's a great point for her because she doesn't give us an awful lot, and you
Yeah.
do sort of feel of putting yourself. It's almost like it's a blank space that you have to
Mm,
fill as the reader. In terms of like, well, she probably felt this, or
yeah.
this is the impact that it would have had because she sort of just talks about the nuts and bolts of her day to day living and what how it affected her. You know, physically rather than
Yeah.
emotionally in a lot of ways. She
Yeah.
talks on it very, very briefly, but it's not like there's a whole section devoted to dealing with the aftermath of the death of her
Mm,
husband or anything like that. It's very much then back to her mother's influence on her life and all of that kind of stuff. Without that, but obviously she kept his name
yeah.
for
Yeah.
for the rest of her life, even though she remarried and stuff. So there's again this kind of bit where you're projecting onto the character. It
Hmm.
obviously meant a lot to her.
Yeah. Yeah. And I I would be hard pressed to point out the specifics, but I did get the sense that he meant a lot to her. And you're right. Like I did wonder for a while if this was even say a happy marriage, just
Hmm.
based on how she wrote about his
That's
death.
right.
But there was something she said after that made me think that she did really miss him, and she just wasn't writing about it for whatever reason. And I think when she talked about how her mother came to help her during the difficult time, that may have been where I got this sense that it was hard. And I think going back to what you said, the last name also, that she still has, that she published this book under, that also I think gave me the impression that this is something that matters to her. So
Yeah. And the fact probably that she ended up then moving away. She moved to London,
yeah,
England
yeah,
as well. At the end of it all, we don't get the reasons why or what happened. That could have been for marriage, could have been the death of parents, whatever it is. But that again, there's another country that they visited as a family and kind of settled
mm,
in and wrote about. So yeah, it's it's an interestingly intriguing book. Like
yeah,
it's not like loads of events happening, but it's just the right length, I think, in
mm,
terms of not outstaying its welcome and kind of giving you what you need out of it
yeah, yeah.
um and
It's
enough for you to
what
read to. Yeah,
Yeah, just shy of 200 pages, right?
that's right. Yep,
Yeah, it's kind of perfect. But for all that, like 200 pages typically you can maybe read in one sitting or two at the most if
that's right. If you wanted
but
to.
this is not that kind of book. So but yeah,
Yeah,
enjoyable overall. How do you
yeah,
think this was also like a little bit of a difficult book to make up my mind to discuss, for instance, because it
yeah.
is about a real person. So for instance, like we were just talking about the marriage, for instance, right? Like I feel like I have to think a lot harder about the options to discuss about what might be going on there than if this was just fiction and we could speculate about the characters and their
Yes.
feelings. So yeah, the fact that it is not fiction and it's a memoir makes that kind of thing harder, but it still sort of lends itself to discussion like it is fiction, which was interesting.
Well, it's back to the nature of translated fiction again, because again, it's almost like historical fiction in some ways
Hmm.
because it's kind of very much set in a definitive point in time in human history,
Yeah.
um, but yet sort of identifies with people and places that really haven't changed,
Right.
regardless through time. So it sort of gives you a lens or gives you a chance for understanding what it was like
Hmm.
back then and how literally how people haven't changed very much
Yeah.
at all, and how the family dynamic and an awful lot of changes hasn't changed very much. And it's hard not to project some of that onto events of today because actually there's probably more war now than there has been at any stage
Yeah.
just from that point. And so
Mhm.
it does sort of have a relevance um in some ways that we can kind of take from that. How does a family unit survive
Yeah.
those kind of events and that kind of stuff. So I agree with you. It was one of those things that I kind of thought when we were discussing it, we sort of said we were going to read it and discuss it, and then I read it and went, could last 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not really.
Yeah.
there's no real events to talk about, but it's sort of about everything. It's just about people,
Mm.
without necessarily being character studies in some ways, maybe with the exception of the father,
Yeah.
in some ways, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I also did not think that this discussion could go on for very long, but it did. I think that
Yeah.
speaks to the
Yeah.
relevance of the book for
Yeah,
us
indeed.
too. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else spring to mind? I'm through all my notes.
I think I've covered everything that I had.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, only thing left to talk about is the fact that our next book has been picked by you.
Yes, it's called Singularity, and it's also a translation from the Italian. I just
Yes.
realized. Um, and it's about a scientist, which I've been craving. A book about scientists after finishing The Mathematician's Shiva. I
Mm-hmm.
forget the name of the author, but yeah, I'm excited for this one. It's science fiction, which is right up our alley. It's
Mm-hmm.
short
Right
and
up our alley.
yeah, exactly. Can fit it in between all the other 1,000-page tomes that we read
Indeed.
or plan to read in the upcoming months. And yeah, I'm excited to continue
Yeah.
making our way through this list.
Yeah. Like 4 books a year or whatever we're gonna
Yeah.
do. Yeah,
Hey, we
so we'll
make a
have
lot of progress that way.
that's true. That's true. That's 4 more books than I probably would have read otherwise. So yeah, we'll look forward to that. Don't have a date or anything. I haven't started reading it yet myself, but we'll squeeze it in. It's quite short, and that'll be over in Vars's channel and Reading by the Reading Mountain, which there'll be a link to in the description, and you can see you there. So thank you very much, Varsha. Another reading
Thank you so
project
much. Yeah.
started. Maybe
Yeah.
it'll be another person added to the stream in
That
short
will be
space.
great. Yes.
Yeah, if anybody is interested, they can come over to patreon.com, where we organize all the read alongs. It is honestly open to anybody that's interested. And even if you just want to post your thoughts about upcoming books and that kind of stuff, and that will be pretty cool. So until then, I'll catch you next time. All the best.
Bye.